Awesome. Well, it looks like we have some people coming in from the talk. Welcome to the Zoom Q&A portion, discussion portion of Dr. Schiff's talk. We'll just wait a couple minutes for people to jump over into the Zoom webinar, and then we'll get started. In the meantime, if you have any questions for Dr. Schiff, you can ask them using the Q&A tool, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom window. So if you have any questions or comments, things that you'd like Dr. Schiff to clarify or respond to, please feel welcome to use the Q&A tool. And we'll just wait another minute. Okay, so it looks like our number is evening off a little bit here. So great to see, to have all of you in this Q&A session. My name is Nic Weststrate. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and it is my pleasure to serve as your moderator this morning. So we, during this component, you have the opportunity, as you may have heard when you were coming in, to make comments or ask questions to Dr. Schiff, and I'll try my best to curate those questions in a coherent way. You'll do that using the Q&A tool at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please go ahead and ask those questions now. I would like to just open by thanking Dr. Schiff for a great talk. I had the opportunity to actually watch it yesterday. I enjoyed it immensely. Dr. Schiff, you had me right from the get-go with your use of the Magritte Les Allemands painting. That was a really stunning example of how our interpretive frames have been shifting as a result of the pandemic. I just wanted to make that comment because I really think that the use of that painting is going to affect how I see things in my environment moving forward. And I'm starting to recognize the ways in which I'm making a new meaning or a different meaning of things in my environment. So thank you so much.
Thanks for that comment. I'd be especially interested in questions of, to begin with, it's such a strange experience to record yourself without an audience. And I mean, normally when you're talking to people, you get this direct feedback from their faces and whether or not you've said things clearly enough. And you can somehow feel that as a speaker, and recording it by myself yesterday, right? Because I'm no longer in the same environment, as you can see. It's, I don't know what kinds of questions that you guys might have, and that might be a good place to start.
Great. So clarifying questions, follow-up questions about the some of the really important, dense concepts that you brought up. But from my perspective, I thought it was a really coherent talk. I mean, I thought it was a really nice narrative that you had presented us with. So we do have some questions coming in here. Now,
Okay.
I'm gonna start with one though that I think is a little bit that is sort of more on the fundamental level, like maybe a clarifying question to
Okay.
get us started, related, to what you're talking about here, and that is the difference between, or the relationship between, maybe narrative, memory, and historical truth. And I couldn't help but think, as you were talking about this sort of fake news moment that we live in, which is coinciding with the COVID moment. And it really seems that the pursuit of something like truth would be really important nowadays. So I wondered what role truth plays in the interpretation of this crisis and how that relates to something like memory and narrative.
You're going right for the hard question. Is that the?
Oh, sorry.
I don't even have the time to kind of settle into the questions and answers before something like that.
Okay, do you want me to say
No,
one?
that's okay. That's okay. Actually, I'd expect this, and I'm looking at the list of participants to the discussion right this second, and figuring out who some of the people are who would probably be able to talk about this much more eloquently than I would. I think that, as I hope I conveyed, that the process really of making stories together, but also as refracted in our own personal interpretations of these things, of what's happening in the social world, that this is really something that is a social construction. It's interpretations that kind of build up, and I hope that that was also clear from the ground up. Not only we also get messages, of course, from the media, and we hear about the world through other people, but there's a way in which we're grappling with and trying to figure out, what really is happening. What's the truth out there? And there are some things that we can hang our hats onto. I would argue, but in essence, the talk could have been called in a kind of shout out to the tradition within social constructionism, of the social construction of the past, present, and the future. So I think that there are some things that we can hang our hats onto. There are agreed upon kind of facts, but I think that we need to maintain that. But at the same time, these ideas are built from the ground up.
Yeah, and Michelle Ferrari actually has a question related to this. And hi, Michelle. Coincidentally, Michelle was my doctoral supervisor, so great to see you here. He's commenting on this idea that we're asking the question: are stories infinitely plastic? And if we're not in sort of creating this narrative,
That's
pursuing
nice.
an objective truth, that
Yeah.
it introduces ability for plasticity in stories. So I'm not sure if you have thought about that.
That's great. Well, I don't know if stories are infinitely plastic. It's a really interesting idea. Certainly, what we talk about in the past, the kinds of resources that we've encountered, the kind of conversations that we've participated in, they have a momentum to them. And it's difficult sometimes to shake off that momentum, just to relate it back to the talk. And one of the things that just has really surprised me, I don't know if it surprised me, but that I've remarked upon, and others have, of course, too, is just the ease at which kind of these previous conversations that are established and fixed get recontextualized, they get re-resourced within the conversation. So there's kind of, I don't know, there's kind of a force to what's been said in the past and kind of the past constructions that we've made. But there still is plasticity. There still is openness to reconfiguring things. And here the concrete example is, images of Chinese and have resurfaced with a force to them that is just astounding. And you find the same place when thinking about anti-Semitism. All of these images of Jews in the past as being corrupt and conspiring, as trying to control the world, that these things get resourced. So yeah, I would think that there's kind of a force to it, but certainly there's plasticity too.
I just want to welcome the new folks into our Q&A session. Looks like our number is still shooting up. So if you have any questions or comments, you can add those using the Q&A tool at the bottom of your Zoom window. And I do notice that someone's raised their hand, and unfortunately, you won't be able to talk. You won't be able to present verbal comments in this segment. You'll only be able to use the written tool. I apologize for that. So why don't we move on, Brian, to another question that's been asked. And that's coming from Mark Freeman. He wanted you to talk about the ordinary anxiety of narrative and then the anxiety about the current moment. Does that?
Yeah, I mean, that's also interesting. I mean, because that was one of the things that I really tried to emphasize within the talk itself was the normalness in some ways. And I think that this has something to do with the way in which we are constructing this to be a crisis. Certainly, and you know, I've definitely thought as well too about the idea that it's the labeling and the concerted, that there's something to the way in which we're defining it as a crisis that makes it a crisis even. And yeah, I mean, we all have something comparable to what we're doing right this second, which is we all have periods of our lives in which we're trying to think about what things mean. And you know, yeah. So in my book, A New Narrative for Psychology, one of the things that one of the passages that I talk about is Primo Levi. If This Is a Man, and his experience that he's reflecting on of coming to Auschwitz. And, you know, once again, maybe not a normal experience, right? Not even maybe not a normal experience, but also to those kinds of questions. You know, there's kinds of periods of time in our lives where we can't figure out what the direction is, and we ask those kinds of questions. What's going on? How is it that we might piece things together? I think the thing that's different, perhaps, about what's happening with COVID is that we're all trying to do it all together. It's kind of like everybody themselves, but also collectively, is asking the same question. We're asking, you know, what really is happening, and what do we make of all of it? And we're doing it individually. We're doing it within small group conversations. But it's kind of, it's a phenomenon that's spread out throughout the globe. It's not just limited. I don't know if that helps. Yeah.
If I can quickly be the voice of God and come from the off, since Mark asked whether he can ask in person, we actually do have that option. So let me bring him in so that he can ask the question.
Lovely to see Mark.
Great, thanks, Mark.
In a second. There he is. If he unmutes and maybe even turns on his camera, then we can see him and then he can talk to us.
Hey, Mark.
Yeah, nice to see you, Brian.
Good to see you.
I apologize for doing this. My question was too long. But first I want to say I thought it was a great talk, and your talk alerted me to a number of different dimensions of narrative anxiety. The first one is the anxiety of narrative itself, of not knowing the plot to which a given episode belongs. I mean, that's part and parcel of narrative. Then we have the narrative of the virus taking its own course. Then we have the narrative, the anxiety of information, of not knowing the distribution of information, misinformation, and disinformation.
Yeah.
The question I want to ask, though, also has to do with the fourth anxiety, and that is the anxiety of manipulation, which is to say the anxiety of knowing on some level that the narrative is being manipulated by someone else.
Mm.
So if you can just speak to that through the lens that you've been offering us, I'd greatly appreciate that. And again, thanks for the opportunity to speak. You can see why it was hard to put in a chat box.
Hey, you know something? I like this speak coming into speak function, and it makes it feel a little bit more like I'm not isolated here in talking. So I'm really happy to see your face. I'm really happy to have the conversation and to have the question. I think to the first one, it's the question, when do we ever really know the plot? Even of our own lives are constantly evolving. We don't have all the information ever. We don't. And we don't know what the future is going to be. So it's, there's also in that respect, a kind of a comparability, if you'd want, if you'd like, a kind of normalness to what's happening right this second. In terms of the anxiety of being manipulated, this is really peculiar right this second. We're much more conscious about that. Yeah, I referenced slightly the fake news moment that we're living in, the crisis of expertise. I think that has a lot to do with the confusion, right? With the cacophony, it's like, who can you really trust, right? What piece of information are we going to regard as being more useful in constructing a narrative of what's going on? And that's all been marginalized to a large extent. I would think that this adds to it. I don't know if people would think about it as being an anxiety of manipulation. They're just kind of in the thick of it, then we're just all in the thick of it right this second. But maybe we would consider it an anxiety of manipulation. Yeah.
Quick follow-up.
Yeah.
Is it possible that we're entering a new era of interpretation?
I don't know. I mean, I think that this goes back to the thing that Nick led off with. And I forget who the first question was from, but the first question about the difference between this era, is it really normal or not? Maybe it depends upon what we make of it to begin with. That's one thing. And the second thing that I would have to say is that, even when I was beginning to write this talk, and even before I started to write this talk, and actually I see a bunch of my students here at the American University of Paris, they've heard that quote from Raoul Hilberg before, and it was definitely in my mind as I was piecing together the ideas. And I think the thing for me that it really speaks to me about is that, this is part of the process. It's not all that new. I think that there was a period of time, for, something that we regard now and we see is just, it's so established, the Holocaust, much of the history, it's different. People have different interpretations, different nations have different interpretations of it, but it's established facts. This is a historical event for us, right? And, when you think about it, that was not always the case. There was that moment, before the war, those moments before the war, during the war, after the war, where people were really trying to process, what's going on first, and then what really happened, right? We could say maybe that we're entering into a new moment, and maybe that's true. I don't know. I don't really, I think maybe we'll have to wait a few years in order to see what the verdict is on that. there's also a way of framing it as saying that, this is interpretation. This is the way that groups go about together in order to make shared interpretations. And at times, there are times in which it's just blatantly not clear. Thanks. Thanks for the question, Mark.
Related to this, one of the things that I find so interesting about having this talk right now within the pandemic is that we're immersed in this cacophony.
Yes.
This is completely surrounding us, and it's happening also alongside this general suspiciousness that we have about the government controlling the narrative. So that's, for me, when I hear anxiety of manipulation, that's what comes up for me, is that there are bodies that are, or in authoritative voices that are attempting to control the narrative, I think, and that makes me feel manipulated. Meanwhile, I'm trying to make sense of all these sort of sub narratives that are trying to take hold.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have a thought about that. I mean, one of the people who provided a comment had said that they really liked this analogy of people all talking at once in a room.
Yeah.
And that's really what it feels like is happening.
Yeah. I think maybe, maybe we're more conscious of it than maybe we're more conscious of it than everyday people are. But just viewing it, we're subject and bombarded with all kinds of different points of view, even those that you could call propaganda, that people are even recirculating as saying, "Ooh, look at the latest propaganda from China." I think that, there are efforts to instrumentalize, or to instrumentalize this particular narrative that are out there, that we definitely do need to pay attention to. And there also too is this kind of like, ways that the blame is trying to be shifted and constructed in different kinds of ways. I'm certainly conscious about it, and I'm certainly anxious about it. But at the same time, the manipulation itself, also too, because of the cacophony, you wonder what at the end is what we're gonna settle on. Yeah.
And that's an interesting point in itself as well. Will we settle on something? You make the point that narratives are perpetually reconstructed, and 20 years down the road, we're going to be reconstructing the pandemic narrative in a different way. And that's what's so interesting is sort of watching the evolution of that over time.
Yeah, well, actually, the person that I referenced that I was hoping would be in on this call, and I thought that he would find it provocative, is Bill Hurst. And exactly along that point, I think it's a question of whether or not it's going to converge into, an accepted or commonly held, a shared kind of plot line. I think more likely we're going to have multiple plot lines that are going to exist together, owned by different groups, and always open to a kind of a next move, a kind of next move in the conversation and taking it into a different direction. And that was the point that I made when I spoke about the Shoah in the Holocaust. And even if the Shoah is an established storyline, it has converged, in the words of Bill Hurst. There still is openness to it, and still are different ways of thinking about it. And I'm not even here talking about relativization or denial, but the history of the Shoah, it's still being written through and interpreted in different ways through legitimate history.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So just with an eye to wrapping up our discussion, although this won't be the end of the discussion, and I'll say in a minute where we can continue it, but there are a couple questions here that sort of are forward-looking, and I wonder if you could comment on those. So one person asked, what aspects of this clearly unique situation do you predict will lead to permanent changes? versus temporary. And then another question was along with the similar lines, said, what is your imagination of a new normal post-COVID? And those are, I mean, I guess those are rather general questions, but within the context of your talk, I wonder if you have any comments in that direction.
Yeah, well, permanent versus temporary. At first, I was going to say that I'm not a futurist, but I think that there's a way in which I don't know what aspects will be permanent or temporary, and maybe I'll stick with my I'm not a futurist, but we can expect that this as being a part of a kind of continuing conversation. It may get changed and reoriented, but I think that that there are definitely new and different resources that we're adding to that we will take forward into the future, and potentially could change how is it that we even interact with each other. I'm thinking about right this second in France, bisous, people give kisses to each other, or will that come back? I don't know. It definitely will have, if it does come back, a long discussion associated with it. And I would imagine too, kind of resonances from those conversations and from this particular kind of moment.
Right.
Imagining a new normal, I don't know, I think, I think that there's a way that, and this is one of the last things that I said in the talk, that we're going to have to imagine how is it that we can live with this? How is it that we might be able to interact with one another in different ways, face to face, right? Rather than what's become the habitual, which is that we're just talking faces on screens right this second. And the only way that we can connect to each other and connect to each other without spreading something is through the digital face. I think that I think that there's a loss in that, an extreme loss. And I don't know, we're just going to need to figure out how is it that, how is it that we might be able to balance that some people get sick, right? We might want to think about, how is it that we might do our best in order to protect people from getting sick, especially people who are vulnerable, and that it may cause this virus may cause have severe consequences to it. But there has to be a balance to it, I think. I don't think it should be kind of like, let's just not care and not think about it, but let's think about this logically, and balance out what are the real valuable things in life that we don't want to lose, and how is it that we might be able to put those things into practice while at the same time trying to keep as best as we possibly can, the social body healthy. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's a really nice message to leave on, actually. And just a reminder that this is a moment for reflection, an occasion for reflection, a reevaluation of sorts, about what matters to us. And I think that is important and can be done with intention, if we make the space for it. So I want to thank you, Dr. Schiff, for your talk first, and then also for contributing to this discussion and Q&A. This has been excellent, and I think it has just sparked so many additional questions. There are many questions we couldn't get to, but luckily we have other ways of continuing the conversation. There is a platform called Slack, which you would have received an email about, a link to the Slack platform, and you can sign up with your email address, and essentially it's going to put you into a space where there are different channels, and there's a channel dedicated to this talk. So what you can do is you can take your comments and questions, repost them there, and we can continue on the conversation. You can also, of course, tweet about this talk using the hashtag PGC 2020. And there will be on Thursday the 21st and Wednesday the 27th, keynote hangouts. So further opportunity to discuss the content of the sessions with various keynote presenters. So look for those different ways that you can keep talking about this excellent talk. We're a few minutes over time, so I'm going to have to wrap it up there and to say thank you once again to Dr. Schiff for a very inspiring talk.
Thank you, everybody.
All the best, everyone.